The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the Wilson family estate in upstate New York. The air carried the sweet scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of rain that had fallen earlier that morning. Inside the century-old Victorian home, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as family members gathered in the formal living room, their footsteps muffled by the antique Persian rug that had been in the family for 3 generations. Eleanor Wilson, a woman in her late 70s with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, sat in her husband's favorite leather armchair. Her fingers traced the worn leather where Robert's hand had rested thousands of times before his passing 3 months ago. The house still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the lemon polish he used on his collection of antique clocks, now silent throughout the home. Michael, the eldest son at 52, adjusted his tie as he paced near the fireplace. His polished leather shoes made soft, rhythmic sounds on the hardwood floor. The CEO of a successful investment firm, Michael carried himself with an air of authority that had only grown since his father's death. His wife, Cynthia, sat stiffly on the velvet sofa, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously against the expensive leather. Sarah, the middle child at 48, stood by the large bay window, her arms crossed as she watched her 2 teenage children whispering to each other in the corner. As a high school English teacher, Sarah had always been the family's moral compass, though her recent divorce had left her financially strained and emotionally vulnerable. The afternoon light caught the silver threads beginning to appear in her chestnut hair, making her look older than her years. David, the youngest at 45, lounged in a chair opposite his mother, his casual attire of jeans and a faded band t-shirt a stark contrast to his siblings' formal wear. The family's black sheep, David had never quite lived up to Robert's expectations, choosing a life as a freelance photographer over a more stable career. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with his hands, and his kind eyes held a warmth that his siblings often lacked. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4 o'clock, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the house. At that precise moment, the doorbell rang, its sound cutting through the heavy silence. "That must be Mr. Henderson," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. She smoothed her black dress with trembling hands, her diamond wedding ring catching the light as she moved. Michael strode to the door and opened it to reveal a man in his late 60s with a neatly trimmed white beard and glasses perched on his nose. Arthur Henderson had been the Wilson family lawyer for over 40 years, his presence a constant at every family milestone and crisis. "Arthur, thank you for coming," Michael said, extending his hand. "Please, come in." The lawyer stepped inside, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had seen better decades. His eyes, a piercing blue behind his glasses, scanned the room, taking in each family member with an intensity that made them shift uncomfortably. "Eleanor," Arthur said, approaching the matriarch with a gentle smile. "It's good to see you. Robert spoke of you often." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "He was a good man, Arthur. The best." The lawyer nodded solemnly. He was indeed. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table, the leather making a soft thud against the wood. "Shall we begin?" Cynthia cleared her throat. "Before we start, I want to say how much we'll all miss Robert. He was..." She paused, searching for the right words. "He was a pillar of this family." David rolled his eyes, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah, who shot him a warning look. "Robert would have wanted us to handle this with dignity," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "Arthur, please proceed." Arthur opened his briefcase, the brass latches making a satisfying click as they released. He removed a thick envelope and several folders, arranging them neatly on the table. The papers were yellowed with age, their edges soft from decades of handling. "As you know, Robert's will was quite straightforward," Arthur began, his voice calm and measured. "The estate, valued at approximately $3 million, is to be divided equally among the 3 of you." Michael nodded, satisfied. "That's what we expected. But there's something else," Arthur continued, his eyes meeting each family member's in turn. "Something Robert asked me to hold until today." He slid a smaller envelope across the table, its paper crisp and white compared to the aged documents beside it. Eleanor's name was written on the front in Robert's distinctive cursive. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her fingers hovering over the envelope. "Robert called it his legacy of truth," Arthur replied. "He was quite specific that it should only be opened after the initial reading of the will, and only when all of you were present." Sarah leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What does that mean? Legacy of truth?" David stood and walked to the table, his eyes fixed on the envelope. "Dad was always dramatic. It's probably just some old letters or photos. Or something that changes everything," Michael countered, his voice tight with tension. Eleanor picked up the envelope, her hands shaking slightly. The paper felt cool and smooth against her skin. She carefully broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper loud in the silent room. Inside were several documents, their edges yellowed with age, and a smaller sealed envelope addressed to Arthur. "What do these say?" Eleanor asked, unfolding the first document. Her eyes scanned the page, widening with each line she read. "Eleanor?" Arthur prompted gently. "Would you like me to read them aloud?" She nodded, passing the documents to the lawyer. I don't understand. Robert never mentioned any of this." Arthur adjusted his glasses and began to read, his voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "These appear to be additional documents related to the estate, dated approximately 20 years ago. The first is a codicil to the original will, creating a trust fund in the amount of $500,000. $500,000? Michael repeated, his eyes narrowing. "To whom?" Arthur continued reading, his expression unreadable. "The trust is to be established for the benefit of a person named Elena Rodriguez, to be managed by the trustee until her 25th birthday, at which point she would gain full access to the funds." "Elena Rodriguez?" Sarah questioned, her brow furrowed. "Who is that? I've never heard Robert mention anyone with that name." David had gone pale, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. I need some air," he stammered, moving quickly toward the door. "David, sit down," Michael commanded, his voice sharp. "We're not finished here." But David was already out the door, his footsteps echoing down the hall and then the sound of the front door slamming shut. "Should we go after him?" Cynthia asked, her voice laced with concern. Arthur held up a hand. "Let me finish reading. There's more." He cleared his throat and continued. "The documents also include a deed to a property in New Mexico, purchased 22 years ago in the name of Elena Rodriguez. The property appears to be a small ranch with a house and several outbuildings." Eleanor's face had grown ashen. "New Mexico? Robert never went to New Mexico. At least, not that I knew of." "There's a letter here addressed to you, Eleanor," Arthur said, handing her a folded sheet of paper. "Perhaps it will explain." Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the letter, the paper feeling fragile between her fingers. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of a mantel clock and the distant sound of a lawnmower from a neighboring property. "My dearest Eleanor," she read aloud, her voice barely audible. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and Arthur has fulfilled his promise to share these documents with our family. There is so much I need to explain, so much I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid of shattering the life we built together." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. 22 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. A mistake that resulted in the birth of a child, a daughter I never knew but always loved from afar. Her name is Elena, and she is the daughter of Maria Rodriguez, a woman I met during a business trip to Santa Fe. What began as a brief affair ended with consequences I could never have imagined. The room was utterly still, the weight of Robert's confession hanging in the air like a physical presence. Cynthia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Michael's face had hardened, his jaw tight with anger. Sarah simply stared at her mother, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I provided for Elena and Maria financially, but I never acknowledged Elena as my own. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting you, of destroying our family. So I kept this secret, a burden I carried every day of our life together. The trust and property were my way of ensuring Elena would be provided for, even if I couldn't be in her life." Eleanor's voice cracked as she read the final lines. "I hope you can forgive me, my love. I hope our children can understand that despite my failings, I love them with all my heart. The remaining documents will provide more information about Elena and how to contact her, should you choose to do so. The decision is yours, as it should be. All my love, always, Robert." The letter slipped from Eleanor's fingers, floating silently to the Persian rug. She sat motionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room's walls, her face a mask of disbelief and pain. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft sound of Sarah's tears. Then Michael spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "So Dad had another daughter. Another family." "Michael, don't," Sarah pleaded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We don't know the whole story." "I know enough," Michael retorted, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Our father, the pillar of integrity, had a secret family for over 20 years. And now this person is entitled to part of his estate." "Technically," Arthur interjected gently, "the trust was established separately from the main estate. The three of you still inherit the original $3 million as specified in the will." "But that's not the point, is it?" Michael countered, his voice rising. "The point is that our father lied to us. To all of us. For decades." Eleanor finally stirred, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were aged by years in just a few minutes. "Robert was a good man," she said, her voice hollow. He made a mistake, a terrible one, but he was still a good man. Cynthia reached out and placed a hand on her mother-in-law's arm. Eleanor, you don't have to defend him. Not to us. I'm not defending what he did, Eleanor replied, her eyes finally focusing on the faces around her. I'm trying to understand. Trying to reconcile the man I knew for 50 years with this revelation. The front door opened again, and David stepped back into the room, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. He avoided eye contact with everyone as he moved to stand by the fireplace, his back to the room. David, Eleanor said softly. Did you know about this? David's shoulders stiffened. No. Not exactly. What does that mean? Michael demanded, turning to face his brother. Either you knew or you didn't. David turned slowly, his eyes meeting Michael's with a mixture of defiance and fear. About 5 years ago, Dad asked me to do some photography work for him in New Mexico. He said it was for a client, but when I got there, he met me at the airport. We drove to this ranch, and there was a woman there. Maria Rodriguez. And a young woman who looked remarkably like Dad. Why didn't you tell us? Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of hurt and confusion. Because Dad made me promise not to, David replied, his voice cracking. He said it would destroy the family, that it was better for everyone if this secret stayed buried. He said he was planning to tell you all himself, but he wanted to wait until the right time. And when exactly would the right time have been? Michael scoffed. After he was dead and couldn't face the consequences? He was going to tell you last Christmas, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had everything planned out. But then his health declined so rapidly. The room fell silent again, each family member lost in their own thoughts and emotions. The late afternoon sun had shifted, casting golden light through the bay window and illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. There's one more document, Arthur said quietly, breaking the silence. He picked up the sealed envelope addressed to him and opened it carefully. It appears to be a letter from Robert to me, along with contact information for Elena Rodriguez. He read the letter silently, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he looked up at the family gathered before him. Robert wrote that Elena is now 27 years old, 2 years past the age at which she would have gained control of the trust fund. He asked me to contact her and explain the situation, should you all agree to do so. What does that mean? Cynthia asked. Should we agree to do so? It means the decision is yours, Arthur replied. Robert was clear that he didn't want to force this on any of you. He wrote, and I quote, if my family chooses not to reach out to Elena, I will understand. The choice to acknowledge her is theirs to make, as the choice to hide her was mine alone. Eleanor stood slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. I need some time, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We all need time to process this. She walked to the window, her back to the room as she looked out at the garden Robert had so lovingly tended. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber mood inside the house. Robert always said the roses were his pride and joy, she said softly. He spent hours out there, pruning and nurturing them. He said they were like family, they required attention, care, and forgiveness when they didn't bloom as expected. She turned to face them, her eyes clear and determined. I want to meet her. I want to meet Elena. Michael's face hardened. Mother, you can't be serious. After what he did. What he did was wrong, Michael, Eleanor interrupted, her voice gaining strength. But Elena is innocent in all of this. She's Robert's daughter, which makes her family. She's not my family, Michael retorted. And she's not entitled to anything more than what Dad already provided for her. This isn't about entitlement, Sarah countered, standing and moving to stand beside her mother. It's about doing what's right. About acknowledging a part of Dad's life that existed, whether we like it or not. What about you, David? Michael asked, turning to his brother. You've already met her. What do you think we should do? David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and uncertainty. I think we should at least talk to her. Hear her side of the story. She deserves that much. Cynthia cleared her throat. If I may, she said, her voice measured and calm. This is clearly a family decision, but I think we should consider the practical implications. If this becomes public, it could affect your father's reputation, Michael. The company's reputation. Robert's reputation is already tarnished, Michael countered. The question is how much more damage we're willing to let this cause. The question, Eleanor corrected, her voice firm, is how we choose to move forward as a family. Do we let the secret continue to divide us, or do we face it together? Arthur had been watching the exchange with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many family conflicts over the years. If I might offer some perspective, he said gently. Robert was a good man who made a terrible mistake. He tried to make amends in the only way he knew how, without causing further pain to his family. Perhaps the best way to honor his memory is not to judge his actions, but to consider the consequences of those actions on others. He looked at each family member in turn. Elena Rodriguez has lived her life knowing who her father was, but never being acknowledged by him or his family. That's a heavy burden to carry, one she didn't choose. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Arthur's words settling over them like a blanket. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the quarter hour with its deep, resonant tones. "All right," Michael finally said, his voice tight with reluctance. "Let's meet her. But on my terms. Here. With Arthur present to ensure everything is handled properly." Eleanor nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Michael. I know this isn't easy for you." "Easy has nothing to do with it," Michael replied. "It's about protecting the family. All of us." Arthur made a note on his legal pad. "I'll contact Ms. Rodriguez tomorrow and explain the situation. I'll suggest a meeting here in 1 week, if that works for everyone." "That should give us time to prepare," Sarah said, glancing at her mother with concern. Eleanor had already sat back down in Robert's chair, her fingers once again tracing the worn leather. "There's something else," she said softly. "Something Robert wrote at the end of his letter." She picked up the fallen letter from the rug, her eyes scanning the final paragraph. He wrote, "Tell Elena that I'm sorry I wasn't the father she deserved. Tell her that I thought of her often, wondered about her life, her dreams, her happiness. Tell her that I hope she can forgive me, not for my sake, but for hers. Carrying anger is too heavy a burden for someone so young." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she finished reading. He loved her, she whispered. In his own way, he loved her. The family sat in silence, the revelation settling over them like a gentle rain. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room and bathing everything in a warm, golden light. "We should all go home," Eleanor said finally, her voice stronger now. "Process this in our own ways. We'll meet again next week, with Elena." As the family began to gather their belongings, Arthur carefully placed the documents back into his briefcase. "I'll be in touch tomorrow with the arrangements," he said, his voice gentle but professional. Michael stopped at the door, turning back to look at his mother. "Are you sure you're okay with this, Mother? Really okay?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Robert always said that the measure of a person's character isn't in never falling, but in how they rise after falling. He fell, Michael. Now it's up to us to help him rise again." The front door closed behind the last family member, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet house. She walked to the mantel and picked up a photograph of Robert, his face captured in a moment of laughter, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Oh, Robert," she whispered to the photograph. "What a mess you've left us. But we'll get through it. Together." As she stood there, the house seemed to sigh around her, the settling sounds of an old building that had held generations of secrets and now had one more to add to its collection. The week ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and emotional reckonings, but as Eleanor looked at Robert's smiling face, she knew they would face it as a family, whatever that family might look like when all was said and done. The week that followed passed with a strange mixture of tension and anticipation in the Wilson family. Each member processed the revelation in their own way, their reactions as varied as their personalities. Michael buried himself in work, spending long hours at his investment firm, the familiar world of numbers and projections a welcome escape from the emotional turmoil at home. He called his mother twice, each conversation brief and focused on practical matters, arrangements for the meeting, legal implications, and how to minimize potential damage to the family's reputation. Cynthia tried to talk to him about the emotional aspect of the situation, but he always changed the subject, his discomfort palpable even through the phone. Sarah threw herself into her teaching, finding solace in the structured world of literature and lesson plans. Her students noticed their teacher was more distracted than usual, often staring out the window during class, lost in thought. In the evenings, she would sit with a glass of wine and look through old photo albums, searching for signs in Robert's face or behavior that might have hinted at his secret life. She found none, which only deepened the mystery of the man she thought she knew so well. David, meanwhile, wrestled with his guilt over keeping the secret for 5 years. He spent hours in his darkroom, developing photographs he had taken on that fateful trip to New Mexico, images he had hidden away, unable to destroy but unwilling to share. The face of Elena Rodriguez stared back at him from the developing fluid, her features so similar to Robert's that it was almost uncanny, the same shape of the eyes, the same curve of the smile, the same way her hair fell across her forehead when she laughed. Eleanor found comfort in routine, maintaining the house and garden as she had for decades. She spent hours in Robert's study, a room she had avoided since his death, sorting through his papers and belongings. She found letters he had written but never sent, journals filled with his thoughts and regrets, and a small box hidden in the back of his desk drawer. Inside were photographs of a young girl at various ages, Elena, growing up without her father's presence but with his unmistakable features. The photographs were dated and annotated on the back in Robert's neat cursive, each caption a mixture of pride and sorrow. First day of kindergarten, September 2002. She has my eyes, Eleanor. I hope you can forgive me for noticing. 15th birthday, May 2015. Maria says she wants to be a veterinarian. She's always had such a gentle way with animals. High school graduation, June 2017. Accepted to University of New Mexico. I'm so proud, yet I can't even send her a card without raising questions. Eleanor cried as she looked through the photographs, her tears a mixture of sadness for the girl who grew up without a father's presence and anger at the man who had kept this secret from her for so long. But beneath it all was a growing sense of connection to this young woman she had never met, a recognition that they were both victims of Robert's deception in their own ways. On Thursday, Arthur called to confirm the arrangements for the meeting. Elena had agreed to come to the Wilson estate on Saturday at 2 o'clock. She would be bringing her mother, Maria Rodriguez, with her for support. Is that wise? Michael had asked when Arthur relayed the information. Having both of them here at the same time? It was Elena's condition, Arthur replied calmly. She felt it was important that her mother be present, given the circumstances. Of course she did, Michael muttered. This is turning into quite the family reunion. Michael, Eleanor's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp and clear. We will treat our guests with courtesy and respect, is that understood? There was a pause before Michael responded. Yes, Mother. Understood. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the September sun bright and warm, the sky a brilliant blue without a cloud in sight. Eleanor spent the morning preparing the house, arranging fresh flowers from her garden and ensuring everything was perfect for their guests. Sarah arrived early to help, bringing a tray of sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. Michael and Cynthia won't be here until 1:45, Sarah said, placing the food on the dining room table. Michael had some last-minute business to attend to. Or he's avoiding this as long as possible, Eleanor replied, her voice tinged with disappointment. I had hoped he would be here earlier to help prepare. Give him time, Mom, Sarah said gently. This is a lot for him to process. You know how much he idolized Dad. I know, Eleanor sighed, arranging a vase of yellow roses on the mantel. But idolizing someone doesn't mean they're perfect. Robert certainly wasn't. David arrived just before 1, carrying a large portfolio case. He had agreed to act as a sort of informal photographer for the meeting, though Eleanor suspected he was really looking for a way to keep busy and avoid the more emotional aspects of the reunion. The light is good in the living room this time of day, he said, setting up his equipment near the window. If anyone wants formal photos later. I think we're a long way from family portraits, David, Eleanor replied with a small smile. At exactly 1:45, the doorbell rang, its chimes echoing through the house. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothing her dress with trembling hands before moving to open the door. Michael and Cynthia stood on the porch, Michael looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too tight, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Cynthia, as always, was the picture of elegance, her expression one of supportive concern. Mother, Michael said, leaning in to kiss Eleanor's cheek. Sorry we're a bit late. The important thing is that you're here, Eleanor replied, her voice warm despite her earlier disappointment. As they moved into the living room, the grandfather clock began to chime 2 o'clock, its deep tones marking the moment they had all been anticipating with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The doorbell rang again, and this time, everyone fell silent, their eyes fixed on the front door. Eleanor opened it to find 2 women standing on the porch. The older woman, Maria Rodriguez, was in her late 50s, with dark hair threaded with silver and deep-set eyes that held a mixture of apprehension and determination. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a small handbag, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. The younger woman, Elena, was perhaps 27 or 28, with the same dark hair as her mother but with Robert's distinctive blue eyes. She was taller than her mother, with a slender build and an air of quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the nervousness evident in the way she kept smoothing her dress. Her face, though unfamiliar, held echoes of Robert in the curve of her smile and the shape of her jaw. Mrs. Wilson? Maria asked, her voice soft but clear. I'm Maria Rodriguez, and this is my daughter, Elena. Please, come in, Eleanor said, stepping aside to allow them entry. We're so glad you could make it. As Elena stepped into the foyer, her eyes scanned the house with curiosity, taking in the high ceilings, the antique furniture, the family photographs lining the walls. Her gaze lingered on a portrait of Robert hanging above the fireplace, her expression unreadable. Your home is beautiful, Maria said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Thank you, Eleanor replied. Robert and I bought it shortly after we were married. We raised our children here. The unspoken implications hung in the air as Eleanor led them into the living room, where the rest of the family waited. Arthur Henderson stood and approached them, extending his hand. Ms. Rodriguez, Elena, thank you for coming. I'm Arthur Henderson, the Wilson family attorney. Mr. Henderson, Maria acknowledged with a nod. Thank you for arranging this. Elena's eyes moved around the room, taking in each person with an intensity that made them shift uncomfortably. When her gaze fell on David, he nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of their previous meeting. Please, sit, Eleanor said, gesturing to the sofa. Can I offer you something to drink? Iced tea, perhaps. Water would be fine, thank you, Maria replied, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's arm. Elena remained silent as her mother spoke, her eyes fixed on the portrait of Robert above the fireplace. It was David who finally broke the silence, moving to the bar and pouring 2 glasses of water. I remember you prefer spring water, he said quietly, handing a glass to Elena. No ice. Thank you, Elena replied, her voice softer than they might have expected. I'm surprised you remember. I remember a lot about that day, David replied, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that didn't go unnoticed by the others. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time that seemed both to stand still and rush forward. Perhaps we should begin, Arthur suggested, taking a seat opposite the sofa. Eleanor, would you like to start? Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. First, I want to thank you both for coming here today. I know this must be difficult for you. Maria's expression softened slightly. It's been a long time coming, Mrs. Wilson. Elena and I have waited many years for this day. Please, call me Eleanor, she replied. And I want you to know that Robert, he regretted not being part of Elena's life. He carried that regret with him every day. Did he? Elena asked, speaking for the first time. Her voice was clear and steady, with none of the nervousness they might have expected. Because from where I'm standing, it seems he had a choice, his family here, or his family in New Mexico. And he made his choice quite clear. The directness of her statement caught them off guard, and for a moment, no one knew how to respond. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. We're not here to make excuses for Robert's choices, she said, her voice gentle but firm. We're here to acknowledge them, and to try to understand how we move forward from here. Forward? Elena questioned, a hint of skepticism in her tone. What does forward look like in this situation? Are we supposed to pretend that the last 27 years didn't happen? That I didn't grow up without a father because he already had a family he preferred? That's not fair, Michael interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. You don't know anything about our family, about our life with Dad. You're right, Elena countered, turning to face him directly. I don't know anything about your life with him. But I know about my life without him. I know about the birthdays he missed, the school events he couldn't attend, the father-daughter dance I went to with my uncle because my father was too busy with his real family. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken emotions, each family member grappling with their own guilt, anger, and confusion. It was Cynthia who finally broke the tension, her voice calm and measured. Elena, we understand that you're hurt. You have every right to be. But we're all trying to navigate a situation none of us created. Robert made choices that affected all of us, not just you. Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly, some of the tension leaving her body. I'm not trying to minimize your pain, she said, her voice softer now. I'm just trying to understand how a man could live 2 separate lives, with 2 separate families, and never once think about bringing them together. He thought about it, David said quietly. He talked about it sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep. He was afraid, Elena. Afraid of losing everything, afraid of hurting everyone. So he chose to hurt just us instead, Elena replied, though there was less anger in her voice now, more resignation. Maria, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Robert was a complicated man, she said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. He loved you, Eleanor. He never stopped loving you. But he loved me too, in his own way. And he loved Elena from the moment he knew she existed. How can you say that? Sarah asked, her voice filled with confusion. If he loved her, how could he stay away? Because he believed he was protecting her, Maria replied. From the scandal, from the judgment, from being known as the other woman's daughter. He wanted her to have a normal life, away from the complications of his world. Eleanor looked at Maria, really seeing her for the first time not as a threat or an obstacle, but as a woman who had also loved Robert, who had also made difficult choices. Did you know about us? About his family here? Maria shook her head. Not at first. He told me he was divorced, that his children were grown and lived in other states. It wasn't until Elena was 5 years old that he told me the truth. By then, we were involved. Deeply involved. And you stayed with him? Eleanor asked, her voice filled with wonder rather than accusation. I loved him, Maria replied simply. And I had Elena to think about. He provided for us, made sure we never wanted for anything. But he could never be fully present, not in the way a husband and father should be. The room fell silent again, each person lost in their own thoughts about love, loyalty, and the complicated choices people make when their hearts lead them in directions their heads know they shouldn't go. There's something else, Elena said, breaking the silence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn leather journal. Robert gave this to me on my 18th birthday. He said it was time I knew the truth about who he was, and who I am. She opened the journal and began to read, her voice clear and steady. October 12, 1990. I met someone today. Someone who changes everything about how I thought my life would be. Her name is Maria, and she has eyes that see right through all my defenses, all my carefully constructed walls. I'm terrified and exhilarated all at once. Eleanor closed her eyes as Elena continued to read, Robert's words from nearly 30 years ago filling the room with the passion and confusion of a man caught between two worlds. November 3, 1990. I've spent every possible moment with Maria since we met. She doesn't know about Eleanor, about the children. I keep telling myself I need to tell her, that this can't continue, but every time I'm with her, the words get stuck in my throat. She makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. December 25, 1990. Christmas with the family. Eleanor asked me why I've been so distant lately. I told her work has been stressful, which isn't entirely a lie. The guilt is eating me alive. I love two women, and in doing so, I'm betraying both of them. March 15, 1991. Maria told me she's pregnant. I should be happy, but all I feel is terror. What have I done? What kind of man brings a child into a situation like this? I want to be there for the baby, for Maria, but how can I without destroying the family I already have? Elena paused, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. There are more entries, spanning the years. His thoughts about my birth, my childhood, my achievements. His regrets about not being there, his fears about what would happen if the truth came out. She closed the journal and placed it on the coffee table. He gave me this on my 18th birthday, along with the deed to the ranch and the trust documents. He said it was time I knew the truth, but he also said it was my choice whether to reach out to you or not. Why now? Michael asked, his voice softer than before. Why wait until now to contact us? Because Robert is gone, Elena replied simply. I respected his wishes while he was alive, but now that he's passed, I feel like I have a right to know the other half of my family. And you have a right to know me. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the passage of time with its steady, rhythmic tones. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room and bathing everything in a warm, golden light. I have something for you, Eleanor said, standing and moving to a small desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a small wooden box, placing it on the coffee table in front of Elena. What is this? Elena asked, her eyes curious. Photographs, Eleanor replied. Robert kept them hidden in his desk. Photographs of you, at different ages. He wrote notes on the back of each one. Elena opened the box slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one capturing a moment in her life that Robert had witnessed from a distance. Her first day of school, her soccer games, her high school graduation, all moments she had thought he had missed, all moments he had secretly cherished. Tears streamed down Elena's face as she looked through the photographs, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on the back of each one. Maria placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, her own eyes filled with tears. He saw you, Eleanor said softly. Even when you thought he didn't, he saw you. Elena looked up, her eyes meeting Eleanor's across the coffee table. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition not just of their shared connection to Robert, but of their shared experience of loving a complicated man who had made impossible choices. I don't know what happens next, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how we move forward from here. Neither do I, Eleanor replied honestly. But I'd like to find out. Together. As the sun set outside the Wilson family home, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, a new chapter was beginning for this newly expanded family. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with difficult conversations and emotional reckonings, but as they sat together in the golden light of the late afternoon, there was a sense of possibility, of hope, of family redefined and rediscovered. The months that followed the initial meeting between the Wilson family and Elena Rodriguez were marked by a series of carefully orchestrated encounters, each one designed to bridge the gap between two separate worlds that had been kept apart for nearly 3 decades. The process was neither smooth nor simple, but it was necessary, a slow and deliberate unraveling of years of secrets and half-truths. The first few weeks after Elena and Maria's visit to the Wilson estate were characterized by a delicate dance of communication, phone calls that lasted just a little too long, emails that were carefully worded and rewritten multiple times before sending, and occasional text messages that tried to strike the perfect balance between warmth and appropriate distance. Eleanor found herself thinking about Elena constantly, wondering what she was doing, whether she was happy, if she ever thought about the father she had never truly known. She would find herself staring at the photographs Robert had kept, studying Elena's face for traces of the man she had loved for 50 years, seeing him in the curve of her smile and the intensity of her gaze. One Tuesday afternoon, about 3 weeks after their meeting, Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed Elena's number, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "Elena? It's Eleanor Wilson. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Not at all," Elena's voice came through the line, warm and welcoming. "I was just thinking about you. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I was wondering if you might like to have lunch sometime. Just the two of us." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Eleanor worried she had overstepped, moved too quickly. "I'd like that very much," Elena finally replied. "When were you thinking?" "How about this Friday? There's a small restaurant near the university that Robert used to love. They have the most wonderful garden seating." "That sounds perfect," Elena said. 1 o'clock? 1 o'clock it is, Eleanor confirmed, relief flooding through her. "I'm looking forward to it." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This lunch would be their first time alone together, without the buffer of family members or lawyers to mediate their conversation. It would be just the two of them, two women connected by the complicated man they had both loved in their own ways. The restaurant, called the Garden Terrace, was exactly as Eleanor had described, a charming establishment with outdoor seating nestled among blooming flowers and shady trees. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the tablecloth and arranged the silverware just so. Elena arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, wearing a simple summer dress that complemented her dark hair and blue eyes. She carried a small handbag and wore a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, leaning in to kiss the older woman's cheek. "It's good to see you." "You too, dear," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Please, sit." The first few minutes of their lunch were filled with the usual pleasantries, comments about the weather, inquiries about each other's health, observations about the beautiful setting. But as the waiter took their orders and brought them glasses of iced tea, the conversation naturally turned to more personal matters. "I've been thinking a lot about our last meeting," Elena began, her fingers tracing the condensation on her glass. "About everything you shared with me." "As have I," Eleanor replied. "I find myself wondering about your childhood, about the life you and your mother built together in New Mexico." Elena smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes this time. "It was a good childhood, mostly. Mom worked hard to give me everything I needed. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had each other, and that was enough." Did you ever ask about your father?" Eleanor asked gently. "All the time," Elena admitted. "Especially when I was little. Mom would tell me that he loved me very much, but that he had another family that needed him. It wasn't until I was older that I understood what that really meant." "She must be a remarkable woman, your mother," Eleanor said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "She is," Elena agreed. "She never once spoke ill of Robert, or of you and your family. She always said that love was complicated, that people made choices they sometimes regretted, but that didn't mean they didn't care." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over Elena's. "I'm so sorry, Elena. Sorry for the years you spent without a father, sorry for the pain this must have caused you and your mother." Elena's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Their lunch arrived then, interrupting the emotional intensity of their conversation. As they ate, they talked about lighter things, Elena's work as a veterinarian, her love for animals, her dreams of opening her own practice someday. Eleanor shared stories about Robert's love for the estate, his passion for gardening, his pride in his children's accomplishments. "You know," Elena said as they finished their meal, "I always imagined what it would be like to meet you. Sometimes I pictured you as cold and unapproachable, other times as warm and welcoming. The reality is so much more complex than I could have imagined." "I understand," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I had my own imaginings about you, about what you might be like. The reality is, of course, that we're just two people who love the same complicated man." "Did you ever suspect?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you ever know that there was someone else?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. "There were times," she finally admitted. "Times when Robert would seem distant, when he would come back from his business trips with a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't quite understand. But I never imagined. I never wanted to imagine. That's the thing about secrets, Elena said thoughtfully. They're often hidden in plain sight, but we choose not to see them because the truth is too painful to contemplate. As they left the restaurant and said their goodbyes in the parking lot, both women felt that something significant had shifted between them, a connection had been forged that went beyond their shared relationship to Robert, a genuine affection and understanding that promised to grow with time. Let's do this again soon, Eleanor suggested, her voice warm. I'd like that, Elena replied with a smile. Very much. Meanwhile, Michael was struggling to come to terms with the new reality of his family. The revelation of his father's secret life had shaken the foundation of his identity, challenging the image of the man he had idolized for his entire life. He found himself replaying childhood memories, searching for signs he had missed, clues that might have revealed the truth hiding in plain sight. One evening, as he and Cynthia were having dinner in their Manhattan apartment, Michael brought up the subject that had been weighing heavily on his mind. I've been thinking about Elena, he began, pushing his food around his plate with his fork. Cynthia looked up from her own meal, her expression encouraging. Oh? In what way? I don't know, Michael sighed, setting his fork down. I keep wondering what her life was like, growing up without Dad. And I feel guilty, I guess. Guilty that I had him and she didn't. That's understandable, Cynthia replied gently. But it wasn't your choice, Michael. You were a child. You can't take responsibility for your father's decisions. I know that, logically, Michael conceded. But emotionally, it's different. I keep thinking about all the moments Dad was there for me, my baseball games, my graduation, my wedding. And she had none of that. What are you thinking of doing about it? Cynthia asked, her voice careful and measured. I don't know, Michael admitted. Part of me wants to reach out to her, to get to know her. But another part of me feels like I'm betraying Dad's memory, or somehow minimizing the importance of the family we had. Michael, Cynthia said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Getting to know Elena doesn't diminish your relationship with your father. If anything, it expands it, gives you a more complete picture of who he was, flaws and all. Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When did you get so wise? He finally asked with a small smile. I've had a lot of practice dealing with a stubborn, complicated man, Cynthia replied, her eyes twinkling with affection. I love you, you know. Even when you're being difficult. I love you too, Michael said, squeezing her hand. More than you know. The next day, Michael made a decision. He called Elena's office, his heart pounding as he waited for her to pick up the phone. Elena Rodriguez speaking, her voice came through the line, professional and warm. Elena, it's Michael Wilson. Robert's son. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Michael worried he had made a mistake. Michael, Elena finally said, her voice surprised but not unwelcoming. It's good to hear from you. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Michael assured her. I was calling because I'd like to get to know you. If you're open to that. I'd like that very much, Elena replied, and Michael could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. I was hoping you might call. How about dinner next week? Michael suggested. There's a steakhouse in the city that Dad used to love. We could go there, share some memories. That sounds perfect, Elena agreed. Just let me know when works for you. As they arranged the details of their dinner, Michael felt a sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Getting to know Elena wouldn't erase the past or fix the mistakes his father had made, but it was a step forward, a way to honor the complicated legacy of a man who had loved deeply, if not always wisely. Sarah's journey toward acceptance and understanding followed a different path. As a high school English teacher, she had always been drawn to stories of human complexity, to narratives that explored the gray areas between right and wrong. But when it came to her own family, she had always seen things in more black and white terms. Her father was the hero of her story, a man of integrity and unwavering moral character. The revelation of Robert's secret life had forced her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about him, about her family, about herself. She found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How could a man who had been such a positive force in her life have caused such pain to others? How could she reconcile the father she had known and loved with the man who had abandoned his daughter? One Saturday afternoon, about a month after the initial meeting, Sarah invited Elena to visit her home. They sat in Sarah's backyard, surrounded by the flowers and plants she had lovingly tended, glasses of iced tea sweating in the warm September sun. I'm glad you came, Sarah said, her voice warm and genuine. I've been wanting to talk to you alone, without everyone else around. Me too, Elena replied, her eyes scanning the garden with appreciation. You have a beautiful home. You definitely have your mother's touch with plants. Sarah smiled. She taught me everything I know. She says that gardening is like relationships, it requires patience, care, and the willingness to prune away what's no longer healthy to make room for new growth. That's a lovely way to think about it, Elena said, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, Sarah began, her voice growing more serious. About the man I thought he was, and the man he actually was. And what have you concluded? Elena asked gently. That he was human, Sarah replied after a moment's consideration. Flawed, complicated, and capable of making terrible mistakes. But also capable of great love, of kindness, of trying to do the right thing even when he failed. Elena nodded slowly. That's been my experience too. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But he tried, in his own way, to be a good father to me, even from a distance. I want to hear about that, Sarah said, leaning forward with genuine interest. I want to hear about your experiences with him, the moments you shared, the memories you have. And so Elena began to share stories of her father, the surprise visits that always seemed to coincide with important moments in her life, the gifts that appeared on birthdays and Christmas, the phone calls that came at irregular intervals but were always filled with questions about her life, her dreams, her happiness. As she listened, Sarah found herself seeing her father in a new light, not as a perfect hero or a terrible villain, but as a complex human being who had loved two families and had been unable to fully commit to either. It was a painful realization, but also an enlightening one, allowing her to hold both the good and bad aspects of her father's character in her mind at the same time. You know, Sarah said as Elena finished her stories, I always thought of Dad as this larger-than-life figure, almost perfect in every way. Getting to know this more complicated version of him, it's been difficult, but also liberating in a way. Liberating how? Elena asked. Because perfect people are intimidating, Sarah explained. They set standards that are impossible to live up to. But flawed people, they're relatable. They remind us that it's okay to make mistakes, to be human, to try and fail and try again. Elena smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. Dad's flaws make him more real, more human. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Sarah and Elena found themselves talking about their hopes and dreams, their fears and insecurities, the experiences that had shaped them into the women they had become. They discovered they had more in common than they might have expected, a love of literature, a passion for helping others, a complicated relationship with the memory of the father they had shared. We should do this again, Sarah suggested as Elena prepared to leave. Soon. I'd like that very much, Elena replied with a smile. Very much. David's path toward reconciliation with his new half-sister followed a different trajectory. As the family member who had known about Elena's existence for 5 years, he carried a unique burden of guilt and responsibility. He had respected Robert's wish to keep Elena's identity a secret, but in doing so, he had participated in the deception that had kept their family divided. One evening, as he was developing photographs in his darkroom, David found himself thinking about that day in New Mexico, about the moment he had first met Elena and recognized immediately that she was Robert's daughter. The resemblance was striking, not just in her physical features, but in her mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when she was listening, the intensity of her gaze when she was focused on something that interested her. He remembered the conversation they had had, standing in the dusty yard of the ranch house, the New Mexico sun beating down on them as they talked about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about her love for animals, about the complicated relationship she had with the father she had never truly known. Does it bother you, she had asked him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of judgment or disapproval. That I exist, I mean. David had been taken aback by the directness of her question, by the vulnerability in her voice. No, he had replied honestly. It doesn't bother me that you exist. What bothers me is that Dad kept you a secret, that you grew up without knowing the rest of your family. I've made my peace with it, Elena had said, though David could see the pain in her eyes. Mostly, anyway. Some days are harder than others. Is there anything I can do? David had asked, feeling a surge of protective affection for this half-sister he had just met. Just be honest with me, Elena had replied. That's all I've ever wanted from anyone in Dad's family, honesty. Now, as he worked in his darkroom, the chemical smells familiar and comforting, David knew that he needed to honor that request for honesty, to share with Elena the full extent of what he knew about Robert's feelings for her, about the regret that had haunted him in his final years. He picked up his phone and sent Elena a text message. I have something I want to share with you. Something Dad told me about you. Would you be willing to meet? The response came almost immediately, of course. When and where? How about tomorrow? There's a coffee shop near my studio. We could meet around 10. Perfect. See you then. As David put down his phone, he felt a mixture of nervousness and relief. The conversation ahead would be difficult, but it was necessary, a step toward healing the wounds that had been left by years of secrets and half-truths. The coffee shop was small and cozy, filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. David arrived early, securing a table in the corner where they could talk without being overheard. Elena arrived precisely at 10, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. She carried a canvas bag and looked tired but happy, as if she had come directly from working with animals. "David," she said with a warm smile as she approached the table. "It's good to see you." "You too, Elena," he replied, standing to greet her. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" "Just a black coffee, please," she said, taking a seat. "I have a feeling I'm going to need it." As David returned with their drinks, he took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his voice slightly unsteady. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you, something Dad shared with me about a year before he died." Elena's expression grew serious, her eyes focused on his face. "What is it?" "Dad was sick," David began, choosing his words carefully. "We all knew he didn't have much time left, and he started talking about things he had never discussed before, regrets, mistakes, things he wished he had done differently." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "One evening, he called me to his study. He had been drinking, which was unusual for him, and he seemed more emotional than I had ever seen him." Elena leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it. "What did he say?" "He asked about you," David replied softly. "About how you were doing, whether you were happy, if you had ever forgiven him for not being part of your life." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, though she made no effort to wipe them away. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," David said. "That you seemed happy, that you had built a good life for yourself, that you had always spoken of him with a mixture of hurt and understanding." "And what did he say to that?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He cried," David admitted, his own eyes growing moist at the memory. "He said that not knowing you, not being part of your life, was his greatest regret. He said that if he could live his life over again, he would have made different choices, choices that would have allowed him to be a father to both his families." Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "I always wondered," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "I always wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever regretted his decision to stay away." "He thought about you all the time," David assured her. "He had your photographs hidden in his desk, your letters tucked away in a safe. He followed your life from a distance, celebrated your achievements, worried about your challenges. He was proud of you, Elena. So proud of the woman you became." As tears streamed down Elena's face, David reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "He loved you," he said softly. "In his own complicated, flawed way, he loved you very much." "Thank you for telling me this," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't erase the past, but it helps to know that he cared." As they sat together in the quiet coffee shop, a connection was forged between them, a bond of shared loss and newfound understanding that promised to grow stronger with time. The road ahead would still be complicated, filled with emotional challenges and difficult conversations, but for the first time, there was a sense of hope, of possibility, of family redefined and rediscovered. As autumn settled over upstate New York, painting the landscape in shades of gold, amber, and crimson, the Wilson family continued their tentative journey toward integration and understanding. The initial shock of Robert's revelation had given way to a more nuanced exploration of what it meant to be a family in the wake of such a significant discovery. Eleanor found herself establishing a routine of regular communication with Elena, weekly phone calls that gradually extended to longer conversations, occasional lunches that stretched into afternoons of shared stories and mutual discovery. With each interaction, Eleanor found herself letting go of the anger and hurt she had initially felt, replacing it with a growing affection for the daughter her husband had kept hidden from her for so many years. One crisp October afternoon, Eleanor invited Elena to visit the estate, suggesting they spend some time in Robert's garden, a place that had been his sanctuary and the source of his greatest pride. As they walked among the late-blooming roses and carefully tended perennials, Eleanor found herself sharing memories of Robert that she had never before spoken of to anyone outside her immediate family. "He would spend hours out here," Eleanor said, her fingers gently touching a dew-kissed rose petal. "Especially when something was weighing on his mind. He said that gardening helped him think, that the simple act of nurturing something helped him sort through his complicated thoughts." "It's beautiful," Elena replied, her eyes taking in the carefully planned layout, the attention to detail that spoke of Robert's methodical nature. "He had a way with plants, didn't he?" "He did," Eleanor agreed with a small smile. "Though he always said that plants, like people, respond best to patience and understanding rather than force and expectations." Elena stopped walking, turning to face Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. Is that how you see him? As someone who was patient and understanding? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering her response. I see him as someone who tried to be those things, even when he failed. He wasn't perfect, Elena. Far from it. But he was always trying to be better, to do better, especially when it came to the people he loved. Did he ever talk about me? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not in the context of the secret, but just, as his daughter? All the time, Eleanor replied, her voice gentle but firm. Especially in his final years. He worried about you, wondered if you were happy, if you had everything you needed. He was proud of you, Elena. So proud of the woman you became, even though he couldn't take credit for it. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. I never knew that. I always wondered if he thought about me, if he ever regretted his decision to stay away. He regretted it every day, Eleanor assured her, reaching out to place a comforting hand on Elena's arm. He told me once that the greatest mistake of his life was not in loving two families, but in not finding a way to bring them together. As they continued their walk through the garden, Eleanor found herself sharing more intimate details of her life with Robert, the early years of their marriage, the challenges of raising 3 children, the gradual evolution of their relationship from passionate romance to comfortable companionship. With each story she shared, she felt a sense of release, as if by opening up to Elena, she was somehow healing a part of herself that had been wounded by Robert's deception. You know, Eleanor said as they reached a small stone bench overlooking a pond, Robert always said that the measure of a person's character wasn't in never falling, but in how they rose after falling. What do you think he meant by that? Elena asked, sitting beside Eleanor on the bench. I think he meant that we all make mistakes, that we all fall short of who we want to be, Eleanor replied thoughtfully. But what matters is how we handle those mistakes, whether we learn from them and try to do better, or whether we let them define us. And which do you think he did? Elena asked, her eyes searching Eleanor's face for understanding. I think he did both, at different times, Eleanor admitted. He let his mistake define our relationship for many years, keeping you a secret out of fear and shame. But in his final years, I think he was trying to rise above that mistake, trying to find a way to bring our families together even if he couldn't be here to see it happen. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Eleanor and Elena found themselves talking about their hopes for the future, not just for themselves, but for their newly expanded family. There was a sense of possibility in their conversation, a recognition that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still unwritten, waiting to be shaped by their choices and actions. I never imagined this, Elena said softly, her eyes taking in the beauty of the garden around them. Never imagined that I would be sitting here with you, talking about Dad like this. Neither did I, Eleanor admitted with a small smile. But I'm glad we are. More glad than I can say. Michael's journey toward acceptance and understanding followed a more circuitous path. As the eldest son and the one who had most closely identified with his father's values and achievements, he struggled to reconcile the image of Robert Wilson as a man of integrity with the reality of a man who had maintained a secret family for nearly 3 decades. One evening, as he and Cynthia were having dinner at their favorite restaurant in Manhattan, Michael found himself opening up about his conflicted feelings. I had lunch with Elena today, he began, swirling the wine in his glass before taking a sip. We went to that steakhouse Dad used to love, the one with the view of Central Park. How did it go? Cynthia asked, her eyes encouraging. It was good, Michael admitted, a note of surprise in his voice. Better than I expected, actually. We talked about Dad, shared memories. She told me about her childhood, about growing up in New Mexico. And what did you feel? Cynthia asked gently. While she was talking? Michael was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. I felt guilty, I guess. Guilty that I had all those years with Dad and she had none. But I also felt something else, something I wasn't expecting. What was that? Cynthia prompted. Connection, Michael replied, looking up to meet her eyes. I saw so much of Dad in her, not just in her appearance, but in the way she thinks, the way she expresses herself, her values. It was like getting to know a part of Dad I never knew existed. That makes sense, Cynthia said thoughtfully. She is his daughter, after all. But it's more than that, Michael continued, his voice growing more animated. It's like meeting someone who shares a part of your history, your DNA, your understanding of the world. There's an immediate recognition, a sense of oh, that's where that comes from. Cynthia smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. I'm glad you're feeling that way. I know how difficult this has been for you. It has been, Michael conceded. But it's also been enlightening. Getting to know Elena, hearing her perspective on Dad, it's helped me see him as a more complete person, not just the idealized version I've carried in my head all these years. And how does that feel? Cynthia asked, her voice gentle and supportive. Strange, Michael admitted with a small laugh. Liberating, in a way. It's like I've been given permission to be human too, to make mistakes, to be complicated and flawed. You've always had that permission, Cynthia reminded him gently. From me, if not from yourself. I know, Michael replied, squeezing her hand. But sometimes it takes seeing someone else's flaws to accept our own. As they finished their dinner and walked through the streets of Manhattan, the city lights twinkling around them, Michael found himself feeling more optimistic about the future than he had in months. Getting to know Elena wasn't erasing the past or fixing the mistakes his father had made, but it was creating something new, a more complete understanding of a complicated man who had loved deeply, if not always wisely. Sarah's relationship with Elena continued to deepen through their shared love of literature and their mutual understanding of what it meant to grapple with complicated family dynamics. One Saturday afternoon, Elena visited Sarah's home, where they sat in the cozy living room surrounded by books and artwork, cups of tea steaming between them. I've been reading the book you recommended, Elena said, gesturing to a copy of East of Eden sitting on the coffee table. It's incredible. Isn't it? Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. Steinbeck has such a profound understanding of human nature, of the way families can both wound and heal us. There's this line that keeps sticking with me, Elena said, picking up the book and flipping through the pages. The one about how there's only one story in the world, the story of good and evil, of choice and consequence. Timshel, Sarah said softly. The Hebrew word for thou mayest. The idea that we have the power to choose our path, that we're not destined to repeat the mistakes of our parents. That's the one, Elena agreed, her expression thoughtful. It makes me think about Dad, about the choices he made and the consequences they had for all of us. What do you think about his choices? Sarah asked gently. Now that you've had some time to process everything? Elena was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. I think he made some terrible choices, choices that caused a lot of pain. But I also think he was trying, in his own way, to do the right thing, even when he failed. That's how I see it too, Sarah replied. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But he was trying to navigate an impossible situation, to love two families without destroying either one. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he had chosen differently? Elena asked, her eyes searching Sarah's face for understanding. All the time, Sarah admitted. I wonder what our lives would have been like if he had brought our families together, if we had grown up knowing each other, if we had been one big, complicated, blended family. Do you think we would have been happier? Elena asked. I don't know, Sarah replied honestly. Maybe not. Maybe the secrecy, the separation, allowed each of our families to develop in its own way, to find its own identity without the complications of blending two very different worlds. But we missed out on knowing each other, Elena pointed out, her voice tinged with regret. We did, Sarah agreed. But we have the chance to know each other now. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Elena smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. It counts for a lot. More than you know. As they continued their conversation, moving from literature to life, from fictional families to their own complicated reality, Sarah found herself feeling grateful for this new relationship that was emerging from the ashes of her father's secrets. Getting to know Elena wasn't replacing what had been lost, but it was creating something new, a connection based on mutual understanding and shared experience, a recognition that family is not just about bloodlines, but about the choices we make to love and support each other despite our flaws and imperfections. David's relationship with Elena continued to evolve through their shared creative sensibilities and their mutual understanding of what it meant to be the family members who had known about the secret before it was revealed to everyone else. One Sunday afternoon, Elena visited David's photography studio, a large, airy space filled with equipment, prints, and the distinctive smell of photographic chemicals. This is amazing, Elena said, her eyes taking in the large prints hanging on the walls, landscapes, portraits, abstract compositions that captured moments of beauty and emotion with striking clarity. Thanks, David replied, a note of pride in his voice. It's my sanctuary, the place where I can process the world and my place in it. Elena stopped in front of a series of photographs from New Mexico, stark landscapes, weathered faces, abandoned buildings that spoke of a harsh but beautiful environment. Did you take these when you came to visit me? Some of them, David admitted. Others were from different trips, but they all capture something about the Southwest that speaks to me, the starkness, the resilience, the beauty and imperfection. That's how I think of our family too, Elena said thoughtfully. Stark, resilient, beautiful in its imperfection. David smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. I like that. It's a much more poetic way of describing the mess we're all in. Is it a mess? Elena asked, turning to face him. Or is it just life? Both, probably, David replied with a laugh. Life is messy, especially when it comes to family. As they continued to move through the studio, David found himself sharing more of his work with Elena, not just the finished pieces that hung on the walls, but also the works in progress, the experiments and failures that were part of his creative process. With each photograph he shared, he felt himself opening up, allowing Elena to see not just the artist he presented to the world, but the complicated, vulnerable person underneath. You know, Elena said as they looked at a series of portraits of elderly people, each face a map of wrinkles and experiences. You have a way of seeing people, of capturing their essence in a way that reveals their strength and vulnerability at the same time. I try to see the whole person, David explained. Not just the surface, but what's underneath, the history, the emotions, the stories that make them who they are. Like Dad, Elena said softly. You see him as a whole person, not just as the perfect hero or the flawed villain. David was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I do. I see him as someone who loved deeply, if not always wisely. Someone who tried to do the right thing, even when he failed. Someone who was human, with all the complications and contradictions that entails. And what about you? Elena asked gently. How do you see yourself? David was surprised by the question, by the directness of it. I don't know, he admitted after a moment's consideration. I guess I see myself as someone who's still figuring things out, still trying to understand my place in the world and in our family. You're doing better than you think, Elena assured him, her eyes meeting his with warmth and understanding. You're honest, you're compassionate, you're talented. You're a good brother, a good son, a good person. Even though I kept your secret for 5 years? David asked, his voice tinged with the guilt that still haunted him. Especially because of that, Elena replied firmly. You kept Dad's secret out of loyalty to him, out of respect for his wishes. That says something about your character, about your capacity for love and loyalty. As they stood together in the quiet studio, surrounded by images that captured moments of beauty and emotion, David felt a sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Elena's forgiveness, her understanding, meant more to him than he could express. It was a gift, a recognition that his complicated loyalty to his father hadn't been a betrayal of her, but rather a testament to the complicated nature of love and family. Thank you, David said softly, his voice thick with emotion. For understanding, for forgiving, for being here. Of course, Elena replied, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his arm. That's what family does, isn't it? They understand, they forgive, they're there for each other, even when things are complicated and messy. As autumn gave way to winter, bringing with it the first snowfall of the season, the Wilson family continued their journey toward integration and understanding. The initial shock of Robert's revelation had transformed into a more nuanced exploration of what it meant to be a family in the wake of such a significant discovery. Thanksgiving arrived with unseasonably cold weather, the landscape blanketed in a pristine layer of snow that transformed the Wilson estate into a winter wonderland. For the first time, Elena and Maria were invited to join the family celebration, an invitation that was both symbolic and significant, a recognition that they were now, officially, part of the family. The atmosphere in the house was filled with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness as family members arrived, each carrying dishes that contributed to the traditional feast. Michael and Cynthia arrived first, bringing a perfectly roasted turkey that Cynthia had spent the morning preparing. Sarah followed with her famous sweet potato casserole, while David brought a selection of wines that he had carefully chosen to complement the meal. Elena and Maria arrived just as Eleanor was putting the finishing touches on the dining room table, arranging candles and place settings with the precision and care that characterized everything she did. Welcome, Eleanor said, greeting them at the door with genuine warmth. We're so glad you could join us. Thank you for having us, Maria replied, her eyes taking in the festive decorations with appreciation. Everything looks beautiful. As they moved into the living room, the rest of the family gathered around, offering greetings that were at once formal and friendly, the awkwardness of their new relationship gradually giving way to a more comfortable familiarity. The meal itself was a study in family dynamics, a carefully choreographed dance of conversation and connection that balanced the weight of their shared history with the promise of their future together. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her presence a calming influence that kept the conversation flowing and the potential awkwardness at bay. I was thinking about Robert today, Eleanor said as they began the meal, her voice soft but clear. About how much he loved Thanksgiving, about how he would always say that gratitude was the antidote to regret. That sounds like something he would say, Sarah replied with a small smile. He was always trying to find the philosophical angle on everything. He was, Eleanor agreed. But he was right, wasn't he? That focusing on what we're grateful for helps us move beyond the things we regret. What are you grateful for this year, Mom? Michael asked, his voice gentle. Eleanor looked around the table, her eyes meeting each person in turn. "I'm grateful for family," she said finally. "For the family I've always had, and for the family that's growing. I'm grateful for second chances, for forgiveness, for the opportunity to know each other better." As the meal continued, the conversation gradually became more relaxed, more natural. Stories were shared, laughter filled the room, and for the first time, there was a sense that this newly expanded family might actually work, that they might find a way to move forward together despite the complications of their shared history. After dinner, as they gathered in the living room for coffee and dessert, Elena found herself sitting next to Michael, their earlier conversations having established a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. "I never imagined this," Elena said softly, her eyes taking in the scene around her, family members talking and laughing, the warm glow of lamps, the comfort of a home filled with love and history. "Neither did I," Michael admitted. "But I'm glad we're here, glad we're trying to make this work." "It's not easy, is it?" Elena observed. "Navigating all these complicated emotions and histories." "No," Michael agreed. "But nothing worthwhile ever is." As they sat together in the comfortable silence that followed, Elena felt a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before, not just acceptance, but genuine inclusion, a recognition that she was now, officially, part of this family, with all its complications and contradictions. The holiday season continued with a series of carefully orchestrated celebrations and gatherings, each one designed to strengthen the bonds that were forming between the two branches of Robert's family. There were tree decorating parties, gift exchanges, and New Year's Eve celebrations that gradually transformed from awkward obligations to genuine expressions of family connection. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and fresh starts, the Wilson family had settled into a new normal, a complicated, sometimes messy, but ultimately rewarding configuration of relationships that honored both the past and the future. Eleanor and Elena had established a routine of weekly lunches and regular phone calls, their conversations gradually deepening from superficial pleasantries to genuine exchanges of thoughts, feelings, and experiences. With each interaction, Eleanor found herself letting go of the residual anger and hurt she had initially felt, replacing it with a growing affection for the daughter her husband had kept hidden from her for so many years. Michael and Elena had developed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared values, their conversations often focusing on their professional lives, their hopes for the future, and their complicated relationship with the memory of their father. Michael had even invited Elena to consult on a philanthropic initiative his company was launching, a project focused on supporting veterinary services in underserved communities. Sarah and Elena had bonded over their shared love of literature and their mutual understanding of what it meant to grapple with complicated family dynamics. They had started a monthly book club, just the two of them, meeting in cozy cafes or quiet corners of libraries to discuss the books they were reading and the ways in which stories helped them make sense of their own lives. David and Elena had developed a creative partnership, collaborating on a photography project that explored themes of family, identity, and belonging. Their work together had resulted in a series of powerful images that captured the complicated emotions and relationships that defined their newly expanded family, images that they planned to exhibit in a local gallery. Maria, too, had found her place in this new configuration of relationships, developing friendships with Eleanor and the other family members that were based on mutual respect and shared experience. She and Eleanor had established a routine of morning walks, their conversations gradually moving from the safe territory of gardening and weather to more personal topics, their memories of Robert, their experiences as single mothers, their hopes for their children's futures. As the one-year anniversary of Robert's death approached, the family gathered once again at the Wilson estate, this time not to mourn his passing but to celebrate his life and the complicated legacy he had left behind. The atmosphere in the house was different from what it had been a year earlier, less somber, more reflective, filled with a sense of peace and acceptance that had been absent in those early days of grief and discovery. "I've been thinking about what Dad would think of all this," Michael said as they gathered in the living room, the late afternoon light streaming through the windows. "About how our family has changed since he died." "I think he'd be pleased," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but certain. "I think he'd be glad to see us all together, getting to know each other, finding a way to move forward." "I hope so," Sarah said. "I hope he'd be glad that we're not letting his mistakes define us, that we're finding a way to honor the good parts of who he was while acknowledging the bad." "He would be," Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. "He always said that the measure of a person's character wasn't in never falling, but in how they rose after falling." As they sat together in the comfortable silence that followed, each lost in their own thoughts and memories, there was a sense of completion, of resolution, of a complicated journey that had led them to this moment of understanding and acceptance. The legacy of Robert Wilson was not a simple one, it was a complicated tapestry of love and betrayal, of mistakes and regrets, of choices made and consequences lived with. But as his family sat together in the home he had built, surrounded by the people he had loved in his own complicated, flawed way, there was a sense that his legacy was ultimately one of love, messy, imperfect, complicated love, but love nonetheless. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.